Okay, hi everybody. We're going to come back together. My name is Deborah Thomas, and I'm a professor of anthropology here in the department at Penn. I am here with esteemed colleagues, Monique Scott from Bryn Mawr, Grace Cow from the Department of Sociology here. You already heard from Chris, and Camille Charles in Sociology and Africana Studies. Their bio information is in your packet, so I won't go into all of their illustrious accomplishments. You can look it up on your own. And so the purpose of this section of the evening is really to kind of flesh out the conversation a little bit more. As you know, our topic tonight is really geography, culture, and race. Is ancestry connected to race? How do we think about the relationships among race, territory, culture, language, civilization, etc.? And Lanika gave you a good primer at the beginning, and then Chris fleshed out some of those issues in his talk about the ancient Peruvian skulls in the Morton collection. So we're just going to kind of take off on some of those issues, and everyone will provide, some information based on their areas of expertise. And I wanted to start with you, Monique, because so much of your work has really dealt with the way Africa is represented in anthropology museums. And I know you had more to say about the idea that we're all African in our genetic origins. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and then also give us a sense of what you see in terms of how people approach those kinds of exhibits in museums.
Sure. First, I want to say enormous thanks to the Penn Museum and to Deb and Kate and John and Janet for hosting this very important, very meaningful series of conversations about race and science. And I will say very briefly that I trained as a bioanthropologist. I was always passionate about science and evolution and museums, and also being a Black bioanthropologist, I became interested in the ways that we talk about evolution and the way that evolution and culture intermingle, science and culture intermingle, and how museums represent anthropology, and because of that, how museum visitors come to know who they are and where they come from. And much of my interest, as Deb mentioned, has been in this notion that Chris referred to about us all being African. What does that mean? And also generally out of Africa, African origins, which was big when I was starting graduate school, like in the early 90s, in the mid 90s. This notion out of Africa, what does that mean for all of us? And the emphasis on the out of Africa, not considering the billion or so people living in Africa. So I became really interested in how these scientific origin stories were being communicated and perceived culturally. Okay, so moving more specifically into this expression, we are all African. I think that expression intrigues me for a number of reasons, and it really came out of some of the more recent genetic work and connecting us to a human ancestor in Africa 200,000 years ago. I guess it's not recent anymore, that research. But it was a kind of a revelation, and the subsequent genetic research on human similarities. So I'm going to share with you a quote from Spencer Wells of the Genographic Project. And he states, quote, "You and I, in fact, everyone all over the world, were literally African under the skin. Brothers and sisters separated by a mere 2,000 generations. Old-fashioned concepts of race are not only socially divisive, but scientifically wrong." So this is good, right? This is having us think about, having us use scientific information, genetic information, to kind of unify us. And then I also want to share words written by a British op-ed columnist commenting on new scientific evidence for a recent African Eve. He writes, quote, "I had my DNA examined by a prominent genetic specialist here, and what do you know? It turns out I'm African American. The mitochondria in my cells show that I'm descended from a matriarch who lived in Africa, possibly in present-day Ethiopia or Kenya." Interesting here that the British journalist chooses to be African American rather than Kenyan, Ethiopian. So again, slippage in these terms. But so while a little playful, the statement shows how kind of invested we are, our individuals can be in resolving their identity through genetics are in science. And it seems to promote a sense of common humanity, but I wonder if it does. I just want to share one other quote to help us think about what these African origins stories can mean and the conflicting implications of them. So I heard a Radiolab podcast where a Black man in California allowed direct-to-consumer genetic testing inform him that he was no longer Black. And it radically changed who he thought he was. So I wonder, should that determine who we are, where we come from? So quickly, the quote, Wayne Joseph, the principal of a big suburban high school in Southern California, had an unequivocal sense of his Black heritage, having written extensively about race in America. But after seeing a TV story last April about a Florida company, DNA Print Genomics, which marketed an ancestry test, he began to wonder exactly how much of him was African and how much wasn't, and what else there might be in his genes. So he sent away for the kit, and a few weeks later, the results arrived to his home. And he says, "I just glanced at it, just a cursory glance initially. Then I went back to it because all of a sudden it hit me exactly what I'd read. And it read 57% Indo-European, 39% Native American, 4% East Asian, and 0% African. After a lifetime as a Black man, Wayne Joseph discovered," this is the article, "that he probably isn't Black at all." So that makes me question, what determines our Blackness? Is it, for me, is it one drop or a certain percentage of my genetic material that I received and send away at home, right to my home kit? Or is it my lived experience and cultural experiences, the experiences of my parents and my grandparents? So continually, I am wondering how these African origin stories become part of our identity or complicate our identity in both positive and perhaps challenging ways.
I think what's interesting about the examples you're raising there also, Monique, is that in each case, people are looking to the genetic science to validate something they already know, experience, and live.
Absolutely.
Socially. So I wonder if you can say something more about our tendency to privilege the scientific explanation over the social historical explanation.
Absolutely. So two pieces of that I think are interesting. Privileging the science over our cultural experience. I think historically, and we can see in museums, the 19th century museum with the burgeoning discipline of anthropology was saying, this is who you are, and there's evidence for it, visual evidence that you can see, whether it's the Morton collection or photographs. I think people feel a sense of authority in that. I think also that people like specific answers. And in reality, it's much more complicated. It's much more messy. And good anthropology can teach you that. You know, it's very messy, your identity. But to your other point, I have definitely found that people want validation of who they are. And this is 19th century Victorian anthropology, having a progress narrative, you know, from black to brown to white, that reassured Europeans that though from an African ape or an African human being, that they were evolving towards something better. I think there are ways in which people look for the answers they want. And sometimes genetic tests can give that, or sometimes you can interpret them to give you that.
To have given that, yeah. And I think it's why, you know, we say things like race is a social construction, and that's so often misunderstood, because it's not to say that it's not real and that it doesn't have real effects, and that racism isn't a real effect of the history of racial division, but just that those histories are not fixed in time and space in the way that they've often been portrayed to be. And I think what often falls out of that narrative, from black to brown to white, or that progress civilization narrative that was so formative for scientific racism, also that we all move from a state of savagery to a state of barbarism to a state of civilization. Of course, the Europeans are the civilized people, and everybody else is somewhere else on that continuum until we get to Africans at the lowest point of that hierarchy. Is that it's really arbitrary where people have been placed, and also there are many different groups from 5 to 22 for Morton and Brinton and other people who ultimately were asked to define what these categories are on population censuses. You know? So since this is your specialty, Grace, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the history of U.S. Census, racial categories on the U.S. Census, and particularly with respect to Asian Americans. I mean, Lanika was talking earlier about this process of racial fixing that happens, you know, with the settlement of the New World. So in a way, what we see with the history of these categories is that things get fixed, then things move, and it's there's an arbitrariness to that, which is political, right? Yeah.
Right. So thank you again for having me here. Camille and I are both sociologists, so you might hear a little bit of an echo chamber between the two of us. But you know, we believe most things are social constructs, probably everything. But of course that means, it still means that it's real, because if you believe it to be real and you act upon it, therefore it's real. What amazed me when I first started studying sociology and the sociology of race and ethnicity was that all of these categories that we take for granted have changed, not you know, we're talking hundreds of years, but they change pretty much with every census. The categories change. And it's not as if the people have changed and somehow we've, you know, reassigned, I don't know, somehow, you know, a computer sort of resorted all of us and my color went from, you know, yellow to darker yellow, whatever. It's not that. It's just, it's a categorization of people. And the groups that we think of as groups today are not the groups that even at the beginning of my training were the you know, the groups, and probably in the next decade or two is also going to change. My students, when I teach classes, they always want me to tell them what they are. So they'll say, okay, my mother was born in Honduras, but she came from this place, and my father is from Wyoming, but you know, he's actually from Canada, and his father came, you know, so they have these complicated histories. Or I tell them, you know, someone who's a first-generation immigrant is someone who was born abroad and then migrate. Someone who's a second-generation immigrant is someone who's born in the US and their parents are immigrants, and then you can sort of go down the line, right? So that's a very simple and nice definition. But real people, again, it's these complicated histories. Well, my mother, you know, is fourth generation California. My father came just before I was born, so what am I? You know, so everybody wants me to tell them. Sometimes I have students telling each other, oh no, you're not really African American, you're black. No, you're really, you know, so we get into these discussions. And the truth is, you know, I tell my students, you can individually at home decide that you're X, right? I'm not here to tell you what you are. But the way you look, the way you live, the neighborhoods you live in, where your family is, their socioeconomic status, all this stuff, when you walk down the street, people will ascribe a set of categories onto you. And so whether you like it or not, even if I don't think of myself as Asian, kind of stuck with it, right? Just I walk down the street. And some places, in Chicago, I can sort of pass for Mexican sometimes. I pass for a few things, but I probably can't pass for Swedish, right? There are some things I can't pass for. So, okay, going back a little bit. So I guess I can talk about Asian Americans a little bit with a little bit of specificity, and this might go back to that gentleman's question about education. So in the US, we've had exclusion laws that kept certain groups of people out. We didn't always have them, but of course, slaves and descendants of slaves were here not by their choice, of course, and then we had American Indians, so I'm not talking about those two populations. But when Europeans came and then other groups, the Chinese in the US were the first to be excluded by nationality. So it was the first time that the US said, guess what, people from China, we don't want any more, we've got enough of them, stay out. So that was in 1882. In 1907, we said, okay, we've sort of gotten rid of the Chinese. Now we don't really want the Japanese, right? Because they were doing well in California. They had farms. They were moving up the socioeconomic status ladder. So that's sort of a word that we use to mean class. And so, no, that's enough of them. And we go down the line, and then by 1917, we have this thing called the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. And if you go on Wikipedia or anywhere on Google, you can look at this map. And this map is, it gives a latitude, longitude, but you can see that it pretty much encompasses the places we think of as where Asian Americans are from. Okay, so it's not, these things did not come from Asian American, this was like a government-defined thing. Because again, if you went in at that period and you talked to someone from Indonesia and someone from Japan, I can assure you they did not see themselves as being part of the same people in any way whatsoever. So 1917, we got rid of the Asians, right? No more Asians, okay. So then in the 20s, we thought, okay, we have enough, we really need more Northern and Western Europeans. We have too many Southern Europeans and Jews, so we're gonna keep them out. So there's an adjustment in the 20s that basically takes us back to a different census decade. So we say we want to accept the number of immigrants that match the 1890 population. So we want things to go back to the way it was. That sounds familiar to some people, probably, right? So that's how we dial it back. So that just sort of takes care of a lot of different national groups. But I just want to say very strongly that it did start with Asians who were seen as very foreign, as seen Orientals. A lot of the cartoons in California will parallel the experience of the Oriental in the West and the blacks in the South. So these were seen as similar issues. The Chinese and Japanese, when they first came, new groups are all sort of have to live with the same kinds of stereotypes, right? That they're dirty, they're dumb, they're prone to criminality, the women are all prostitutes, they spread disease, all this stuff, and you can, and so forth. And that was a reason to keep those groups out. Okay, so that's my sort of, so that's one place that the Asian American identity sort of comes out. The reason, if you look today, today's population, most people that you meet of Asian American descent are children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. And that's because we didn't allow them back in until 1965. So that's not by accident. So if you look at the random Asian person on the street, okay, probably not if you're in California, you'll get more third or fourth or fifth generation folks. But most people you see, they're gonna be immigrants or children of immigrants. And that's because we didn't let them in. For Latinos, another complicated history, which of course we think of, let's keep Mexicans or other groups out, but we have to remember that we sort of ate a large part of Mexico, right? So we just took over. It's not like they didn't come, we sort of went there and just, okay, that's a different thing. But I want to say a little bit just about the word Hispanic. Does anyone know what that means, or like what does Hispanic mean? Pardon? Speak Spanish? Okay, as language, okay. And what's the difference between that versus Latino? I don't know who's talking. Yeah, so there's quite a bit of overlap between the two, right? So Hispanic is supposed to be related to Spain. So if you use that definition, includes, of course, most South American countries, but it also technically includes Spain itself. So it's very interesting. A white person from France is white European, but a white person from Spain is actually technically Hispanic. Okay, so that's a funny one. But the other thing is that in 1980, we started counting Hispanic as a different category, not as a racial category. So sometimes my students want me to tell them what's race, what's ethnicity. Maybe you didn't say much about national origin. These are all words that are a little bit slippery. We talk about Hispanic as if it's a race, but by 1980, before 1980, people felt like, no, it's a collection of all kinds of people, right? Because you have white Hispanics, white people from Europe who came, went to Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, take your choice. They're there, and presumably their experiences are different from people who are black, descendants of slaves, and their experiences are different from this other category, which could be native population or intermarried populations. So and of course you can actually have Hispanic Asians because there were people from Japan that went to Brazil and Peru and so forth. Okay, that seems nice and clean, but I can make an argument that Asian could be that kind of category. You have different races, whatever that means. You have people of different colors, right? If we think color is the right gradient, then there are Asians who are white, very white, and there are Asians who are very, very dark. You go to South India, right? So I could have invented that, but that's not what we have. I don't know why we don't have, so you can imagine there's all kinds of ways to play with these categories. Yeah. And my only point is that these are not fixed things. They're arbitrary but not random. I don't know if that makes sense, right? They're not random because of these historical things, and I'm oversimplifying a lot of things, but
it's important because it speaks to how these categories emerge in particular historical contexts, based on particular political realities.
Yeah.
What is seen as a need of the United States at any given moment, what is seen as a need to keep out, and even the opening in 1965, as you say, I think that really raises then the profile of the national origins question, not only for so-called Hispanic groups, but also Black groups, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what opens up non-European migration from the quote-unquote third world. And so Caribbean migration, African migration, and then we see the kinds of dynamics that develop in those generations between native Black populations, African Americans, and first and second generation migrants from Africa and the Caribbean, right, and elsewhere in Latin America. I think it generates, because of the putting together in neighborhoods and schools based on our particular US history of race, it generates tensions, but it also can generate solidarities.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I think there's been a lot of tense discussion about migration in this election period, but I know you also do work on interracial friendships, relationships, dynamics. So what do you find brings us together when we come together?
Okay, so as a sociologist, I think we like to emphasize the macro, historical, economic. We talked about how racism is related to capitalism, so all these big things. But actually, one of the things I study is on a micro level, which means between people. So there's a tradition of studying intermarriage among sociologists as a way to measure whether groups are becoming more assimilated with one another, right? So you can imagine a time where in Canada, my husband's from Canada, French and the English hated each other, right? His grandparents had to run away from home and elope. So, not much intermarriage there. But if you imagine in the US, probably if someone is of English heritage and they're bringing home their partner to their parents who is of French heritage, probably that person will not get kicked out of the house, right? That's not going to be an issue. So if you look at intermarriage patterns, you can see that a lot of European ethnic groups who once did not intermarry began to, and so that helps create this sort of bigger group that are sort of unhyphenated whites, right? But what we didn't study in terms of micro interactions is friendships and dating relationships and cohabs and so forth, because of course we don't just marry people, and actually a lot of people never marry anyway, but most of us will at least have one friend, I hope, and perhaps date a little bit. So we had this opportunity to use this really cool data set, which has a lot of information about which friends kids have. And then we have measures of their friendship and dating patterns we can look at it over when they're children and then when they're adults. So I'm writing this book right now, and I'll just give you a couple of maybe teaser findings. So going to diverse schools really matters. I know we all like to think, oh, the black kids are going to sit together anyway, the Asian kids are sitting together, blah, blah, blah. But really, on an aggregate level, it really makes a big difference. If there are kids of other racial and ethnic groups, they're more likely to have a friend of another race. This is a big deal. We all like to think that somehow social class might, there's argument about whether it increases relationships between people or decreases it, right? So this is an old argument. It turns out for us that it doesn't actually do a whole lot either way, except for Latinos. For Latinos, there seems to be a gradient where higher SES gets you more interracial contact, but a lot of that has to do with the race of Hispanics. I talked about how some are white, some are black, some are other. The white Hispanics seem like they're probably integrating they have a very different experience of assimilation compared to other groups. What else can I tell you? It matters, they start dating interracially a little bit when they're younger. That experience is correlated with whether they date or marry someone of a different race when they're older, and this is controlling for other attributes also. Just going to a diverse school, whether or not that person had dated or had a friend of a different race is also correlated with whether they have friends of different races later in life, which I think that's kind of a big deal. So just being around people. So it is good to, if you like to see progress on this, I guess not everyone.
Make some new friends.
It's good to mix it up. It's good to send your kids to schools with other kids of different races.
Well, so I'd like to move on to Chris now. And so we've heard something about the sort of legal historical delineation of racial categories in the United States. I wonder if you can give us some of this background for Latin America, because as we know, these processes work themselves out very differently there. So what can you tell us about our neighbors to the south and the kinds of racial processes that have developed?
Thank you for the question, and it's absolutely wonderful to be here. As I said before, we often forget that it's so much before Anglo encounters in the Americas and sort of the different society that created. And the Spanish and the Portuguese were moving out in a moment where race wasn't set in the way that we imagine, and it wasn't either for the English. It sort of develops over the course of colonization, but it's instead raza, sort of R-A-Z-A, sort of a root, or a trace. And in that initial context, it was actually more religious than it was, as we think of it, phenotypical. It implied a Jewish origin. And that helps us think about the different relationships that develop through colonization, because at first the rationale for slavery is it is for people who are not who are outside of the faith, who are not, they are the ones who are able to be enslaved. And so you find people in early medieval, early modern Iberia who are old Christians from Ethiopia who are able to ascend, own property, have status within society because they've established themselves as old Christians. Once you get to the New World, though, these categories of who can be enslaved and who can't because of their race become very tricky. We all know that Indians are not from India, and that Columbus was projecting upon them sort of his belief that he had found East Asia. But it becomes a category in itself in which people were at once subject to Spanish and Portuguese labor demands and sometimes outright enslaved, but particularly in the Spanish Americas, meant that they retained some rights if they could survive that initial contact. And if they could get to the end of the 16th century, we actually see a rebounding in communities. And they've reformed themselves as Indians around often smaller towns and villages. They've been concentrated, but have been able to sort of argue for themselves such that we get to the end of the colonial period and there is a strong, lasting indigenous society that's also Christian, that's also really shaping colonial society, that is still subject to labor demands on the part of the Spaniards, and that is also intermixing. Over the course of the 16th century, we see mestizos developed, people of mixed heritage. At first, the Spaniards, the conquistadors, they are intermarrying and also sexually forcing themselves on the female indigenous nobility. They're creating children that then inherit some of their wealth, and it lets them gain access to their property, but it also creates this new category of people who are neither Indian nor European, but can sometimes claim the statuses of each. And so it becomes very slippery in Latin America during the colonial period, because people are able to, depending on what clothes they wear in a particular situation, whether they decide to speak Nahuatl or Spanish, they can affect how they're read. And that lets them affect whether or not they have to pay tribute. It affects whether or not they can move between places. It means that you have the word that shows on the document is chinos, but it's not just Chinese, but Asians who are brought to colonial Mexico enslaved, and they advocate for themselves, and they said, we want to be reclassified as Indians, because we see what the Indians have. They have a community that prevents them from being fully enslaved. It lets them pay tribute to the crown and then get protection in return. And so people wanting to be Indian, and you also see runaway blacks not giving up their status as Afro-Mexicans, but taking on the political organization that Indians have and creating a space for themselves. So you have all these groups that are, slavery's happening, oppression's happening, but by the end of the colonial period in Mexico, for example, the numbers that have been estimated for enslaved Africans, it's decreasing over the colonial period in Mexico, not in places like Cuba and Brazil, obviously, but in Mexico it's 10, 20,000. Freed blacks and people of color in Mexico in that same period, 200,000. So one of the things that we're seeing in the 19th century as the US expands and encounters these other societies is Anglo-Americans freaking out at encountering people of color who have free positions. There's still slavery happening. It's waning faster than it is in North America. But particularly the 1848 gold rush. You have Anglo-Americans passing through Panama and trying to assert their white privilege and the way they understand how an interaction is supposed to go with Afro-Colombian people in the market, people from West India who've been brought in to sort of work on it's not the canal yet, but in sort of the movement over the isthmus. And they don't know what to do with themselves because they're trying to act like they're still in the US, but they're people of color who are starting to identify as sometimes as Latin and something in opposition to the US, it being sort of like this is a heritage that we have that has racial mixing that isn't about lasting slavery as we see that you have in the United States. And these 49ers coming through get in fights, and there's a whole war, that small little skirmish war that happens because of it in the 1840s. And so what's interesting in the 19th century and the 20th century that the identity of Latino is about sort of the long heritage of Spanish and Portuguese colonization, but it's also about lasting indigenous presence. It's also about the enfranchisement of Afro-Latin Americans before in the US. One of the conditions for the end of the wars of Mexico's independence was Vicente Guerrero insisting that, like, if I'm going to bring my army in as a general, I want to guarantee that abolition is on the table, that's going to happen in the next 20 years. And of course, Mexico begins to do that, and the Texans get upset about that. That's a whole other story. But what I'm coming around saying is that Latino is a really fascinating identity for thinking about long-term historical change. It's thinking about how identities are often created in relation to each other. Sort of Latin is something that people pick up start pushing in the 1830s and 40s in opposition to the US, and then get redefined in the 20th century with new migrations and sort of new consciousness once arriving in the US, where you're no longer necessarily Colombian, Mexican, Cuban, or Brazilian, but you can find things to connect on that then give political power and ability.
You mentioned racial mixing and this history of racial mixing. And we know also that for some 19th century independence movements, and certainly in the 20th century, that racial mixing, that triad, right, indigenous, African, European, becomes a central factor in nationalist movements, right, and in the cultivation of a national identity, again, as distinct from the United States, but also to distinguish from places in the West Indies that are predominantly Black at that point, and to make that mixture emblematic of a new national person, right, la raza cósmica, right? One has to be brown, but not be African and not be indigenous, right? But there have been, such an array of very important constitutional changes over the last 20 years or so that have re-recognized the indigenous category and have throughout Latin America and most particularly in Colombia, right? I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what that has meant for indigenous populations, contemporary indigenous populations, and having new access to land rights and other forms of status that had been marginalized during the nationalist period.
Absolutely. I'm not sure I can pull up right to the moment of now, but through Evo Morales in Bolivia, at least, and Colombia. But that's right on point. The late 19th and early 20th century saw in some places like Mexico sort of this emphasis of, okay, we're all a mixture. For that reason, we value indigenous culture, but in our museums. We value sort of artifacts, but in our museums. The clothing is great sort of to wear sometimes for the tourists, but you as a modern Mexican, that's not something you bring on. Of course, that isn't happening in practice, but it's sort of like the language of the government, particularly after the revolution, in creating a new social and national identity that was built much more about class and economics. And you see communities recognize this and reach up from the bottom to sort of grab onto that possibility and sort of remake themselves, sometimes holding on to things that outsiders would say, oh, yes, that's still indigenous, or well, yes, that's still Afro-Mexican, but presenting themselves as, say, campesinos or people who are loyal to the Peruvian state in a way. But what's been really interesting since the 80s and 90s is sort of this reawakening of indigenous consciousness that's insisting on things that have continued to be there. In many cases, they're built on lasting presence in the same places that a community has been for 400 years. You have communities in Peru who can refer to their stack of documents from the 17th and 18th century and say, this tribute record shows that our community has been here since the time of Philip III, that we've been paying tribute, and we exist. At times they've called themselves campesinos or comunidades originarios, but now in some places like Colombia and Bolivia, there is a revalorization of indigenous identity in a non-negative way. In Peru, for a long time and still, to refer to somebody as an Indio can often be a strong insult. It's sort of attributing this negative status that's still associated with being Indian, that comes out of the 19th century and in part the colonial period too. But in recent years, you've seen a reevaluation of that as well, also a claiming of an identity as being mixed, or of being both indigenous but living in the city. There's one of the most fascinating skulls in the Morton collection, to me, is one that's labeled Cholo. And Cholo...
Sorry, I'm from Southern California. It just has a whole other...
It does. And in Peru, Cholo is a slur that refers to somebody of indigenous heritage who's getting above themselves, who's moved to the city from the country, or particularly from altitude. And it's been a very, very strong slur. It can also flag that this is an indigenous person that has lost the things that culturally are supposed to make them indigenous, or they're mixing with other people, they're no longer pure. So the fact that Morton has the skull in the collection is this interesting case of people don't conform to those categories, and the collection's made up of many stories that sort of break down what we think of as race. But in Peru, in the last several years, there's been a sort of a reassertion of Cholo identity as a response to 20 years of migration into the cities, some caused by violence in the countryside, where it's trying to reclaim, we're not just mestizos or Peruvians, but Cholo soy, I'm indigenous, but in this particular new way. It doesn't necessarily, for example, in the Peruvian case, which is the one I know best, have the same sort of legal power to it as it, say, does in Bolivia and Colombia, where communities are able to, by sort of reasserting their indigenous original status, have their own set of laws that sort of allow them to judge and administer power and keep the peace within their own communities. You get that in some places, but it's a fascinating story, and there is this awakening that's happened because, ironically, not because of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism, which was invested in having people stay Indian so that their labor could be peeled off, but nonetheless let people sort of represent themselves through the colonial period in particular ways of dressing still as Indian. But through the 19th and 20th century, when Latin American countries were looking towards liberal democracy and saying, like, we all have to have the same rights, but of course some people are going to be excluded from voting because of their backgrounds or their literacy, and that what was previously owned in property by indigenous communities is sort of slowly getting pulled towards elites. That's getting rolled back in interesting ways in some places, which is a really exciting development.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about the two cases, or the two areas that you're talking about, is the interplay between legal policy categories, the development of legal and policy categories, and the ways people use them to develop a different kind of consciousness about themselves, right? And certainly in this country, we are not immune to forms of constitutional change that are supposed to transform and mitigate our history of slavery and Jim Crow, segregation. Camille, can you go into that a little bit? Can you tell us, in particular in relation to the areas that you've studied extensively in terms of housing, housing laws and segregation, what is that relationship there between law, policy, community identity, et cetera?
Yeah, I think, so when I teach, I actually like to tell my students it's not as effective now that I'm much older, but there was a time when I could tell my students, for example, that when my parents got married, my father is white, he's Mayflower descendant on one side and a Russian Jew on the other. My mom is African American, and that when they got married, it was illegal in 17 states. And that when I was born, it was still illegal in 17 states.
Me too.
Yeah. And that really all of this sort of the law, the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65 and the Fair Housing Act, that all of that happened between 64 and 68. So Loving v. Virginia is in 67, the Fair Housing Act passes in 68, and until the passage of the Fair Housing Act, It was completely legal and common practice to exclude African Americans from any neighborhood that would be deemed a good neighborhood in the United States, that people could sell their homes to whomever they wanted to, and the vast majority of homes were owned by whites because slavery meant that blacks weren't accumulating wealth. And so, and they were excluded from all kinds of jobs because prior to the Civil Rights Act, you could legally discriminate. So there were all kinds of systems in place that made it nearly impossible for black people to own homes and accumulate wealth. Even when they did have the money to buy homes, they were almost always in substandard neighborhoods where the housing stock wasn't as good, where whites took advantage of them quite often, taking homes and chopping them up into these apartments and then charging ridiculous rents for them, using mortgages that blacks could never pay off, and then being able to evict them and keep all of the money. So there were all of these systems in place that made it impossible to buy a home in a good neighborhood. Even if a white person wanted to sell their home, there were usually restrictive covenants in the neighborhoods so that the neighborhood got together and decided you can never sell your home to a black person, and it would say in the deed that, you know, for the next 100 years you can't do this until all of that is made illegal. This also actually includes all of the benefits made available after World War II that led to suburbanization. Government-sponsored mortgages, blacks weren't eligible for those. Places where blacks could buy homes if they had the money for them were redlined so that you couldn't get mortgages for those homes in those neighborhoods, or you got charged higher mortgage rates, or you couldn't get homeowners insurance for your homes in those neighborhoods. So there are all of these barriers to home ownership that sort of work in conjunction with legalized discrimination in the labor market and in access to education. So all of the things that we think about as the path to the American dream are literally legally unobtainable to blacks until the mid to late 1960s. With the Fair Housing Act, it takes an additional 20 years to even fully implement that. And in fact, as recently as 2010, when we had the last HUD-sponsored discrimination study, we still found that blacks and increasingly Latinos, some Asian groups in certain areas are discriminated against in their efforts to secure both homeowner properties and rental properties. It's not restrictive covenants anymore. It's, you know, you have to call more places to see units. It's that if they can sense from the way that you talk that you're from a particular background, you might be told that there isn't a home or an apartment available. It can be tied to what you have to pay for a security deposit, whether or not you have to pay a security deposit, whether or not landlords, mortgage lenders take a favorable or unfavorable view of your credit relative to someone who is white and has the same income and credit scores and those kinds of credit worthiness. So all of those things actually persist because they're hard to prove, right? And in discrimination studies, they do what are called audit studies, and they send out matched pairs of testers. So you get a white couple and a black couple where the only thing that distinguishes them in terms of the characteristics that they're given is their racial classification. And the patterns that I described are what they find. And as I said, in certain regions of the country, so in Los Angeles, for example, Latinos face steering into particular neighborhoods and the other kinds of discrimination I described. Hmong in Minnesota face similar barriers to housing, Latinos and Native Americans actually in the Southwest. So it isn't even limited to blacks, but that's sort of where it all evolved. The reason that all of this matters, right, is that if it took 20 years to actually fully implement the Fair Housing Act, then that means you're talking about 1988, before, in theory, you have sort of free and open access to housing. When you combine that with the benefits of the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65 and affirmative action policy, right, you're finally getting the establishment of a Black middle class who ought to be able to benefit from open access to housing and increase their wealth, okay? Because our income is what we live on day to day, but our wealth is what we pass on to our children. Our wealth is how we send our kids to college. You know, it's how we survive when we have periods of unemployment or other kinds of hardships. So those are two different things. And while there is still income disparity, we have seen the growth of a Black middle class and actually an affluent class of Blacks, and where incomes have improved. Academic or educational attainment has improved. You see more Blacks going to college and graduating from elite institutions, and actually we finally see a generation who can benefit from legacy programs, which, you know, 20 years ago, you could probably put them in one center of this auditorium. But the wealth disparity has persisted. So I actually just read an article that said it would take 228 years to close the wealth gap between Blacks and whites in this country. And it would take 84 years to close the gap between whites and Latinos in this country. Before the Great Recession, whites had 11 times the wealth that African Americans had. And in fact, at one point they said that when we had full service gas stations, and they were more common in the 80s, a white service station attendant would have more accumulated wealth than a Black person with a college degree working in a white collar job. Post-Great Recession, the gap is 18 times. And all of that is, most of that is around our homes. Our home is usually our biggest piece of wealth. That gap increased during the Great Recession because Blacks who were completely credit worthy in terms of conventional mortgages still were far more likely to be pushed into subprime mortgages. So they were more likely to see big losses and be underwater or have their homes foreclosed on during the Great Recession. So housing and all of those civil rights laws sort of are this kind of perfect storm for opportunity, but because there's such a late start, right? So whites have hundreds of years of wealth accumulation and the intergenerational transmission of wealth. The post-World War II era really opens up suburbanization, access to college, and all of those things for whites, where it doesn't happen for African Americans for another 20-some years. And again, it takes a long time to actually implement that. And where we live impacts, and so what that means is we also have really high levels of segregation between whites and Blacks in the country. And so even though it has gotten better than it was, it's still extremely high, and it has consequences for all the other aspects of life, right? So it's hard to go to an integrated school in a segregated neighborhood, so it impacts your social networks for access to jobs and all of those other kinds of things. So we really call segregation and that housing issue the linchpin of segregation and racial inequality in this country.
Just briefly, because I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A, I wonder if you could just say something very briefly about the implications of all of this in a place like Philadelphia, which has a population of long-standing Black middle and upper class, but also a huge migrant from the South population, and then of course as a what's it called, haven city. We're one of the cities that is accepting refugees. Sanctuary city, thank you. We are now seeing a greater influx of migrants and refugees.
So I think the trouble with, on the one hand, we have a diverse Black population, right? You're right, there's a long history of sort of free and elite Blacks in Philadelphia, and the sort of migrant poorer black population from the South and a black immigrant population at the same time, because race is kind of a fundamental organizing principle in the United States, and it has been since our inception. It means that blacks are segregated almost irrespective of their social class status. So with very few exceptions. In Philadelphia, it's Mount Airy, and it's actually West Mount Airy. And that's going to be where you find the sort of biggest concentration of affluent blacks. If you cross over Germantown Avenue into East Mount Airy, so West Mount Airy is about 50-50, and it has been, but East Mount Airy is about 80% black, and the incomes are quite a bit lower. The houses are a lot cheaper, even though they're very similar in a lot of ways. Most of the rest of the city is severely segregated. This is one of the cities in the US that's hyper-segregated. So basically, on any dimension of segregation you would measure, we score high on black-white segregation. Segregation is associated, it concentrates poverty, which is why we're the top city in the US for deep poverty, because our black population is extremely segregated. And by segregating us by race and knowing that race and class overlap quite a bit, it means that you're segregating and concentrating poverty at the same time.
Can I say something just for fun? Yeah. If you're all interested, there are these really cool maps on the web. They have a dot for each person. You can look at different cities. So there's a dot for whites, for blacks, Hispanics, Asians. You can actually see what Camille is talking about. You can look at Philadelphia, you can look at the neighborhoods, and it will astound you. I have students from California who will say, no, my hometown is really, really diverse, everyone gets along. So we pull up the city and I zoom in, and it's like, oh, the Asians are here, the whites are here, the Hispanics are here, and the blacks are there. Like, it's not, So even in California, where we might have a nicer view of.
Well, and it's because there's a difference between integration and desegregation, right? Mm-hmm. So it's one thing to get everybody in the same large geographic space, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily distributed in ways that create actual diversity. And so actually, if you look at West Mount Airy, there is segregation within that neighborhood based on, the 3/4 lot freestanding houses that area of West Mount Airy is far wider, and as you move toward Germantown Avenue and the Twins and then the row houses, it actually gets blacker. But the large area, the neighborhood we know as West Mount Airy, is about 50-50, and it has been for the last 60 years or so.
Okay, thank you. And let's open it up now to questions. There are microphones in the audience. So if you have a question, please go to the microphone so that it can be captured on the recording.
I have a question about West Mount Airy, where I grew up, and what Camille had said earlier, which was in the early 60s, people, the whites had the right to say nobody else can move in here or not. I grew up in that area, exactly. In fact, I moved from one part of West Mount Airy to the other part in '61. And it was already beginning to change. That was right around the time when black families were moving in to houses that were selling for $15,000 back in the early 60s. And, but was what you said, did I misunderstand you when you said that people in the neighborhood had the right to stop that if they chose to? And if that was true, I guess, am I correct in assuming they just didn't choose to do that? Those who left just chose to leave?
Right, so anybody could leave West Mount Airy or a neighborhood, say, that engaged in restrictive covenants. It's just that they could not, if there was a restrictive covenant for their property, they could not sell their home to a black person, they could only sell it to a white person. West Mount Airy is an interesting case, though, because that's a neighborhood that made a conscious decision to integrate. Most other places, and particularly the majority that are not stably integrated, so right, where integration is really just a moment in the transition from predominantly white to predominantly black. West Mount Airy is different because they saw value in integration and they made a conscious decision to become a diverse and integrated neighborhood and actually work quite hard at that. And where most other places transition from predominantly white or all white to predominantly black. And those are places where there may have been restrictive covenants, but the Fair Housing Act outlaws those. And now you can't do that anymore, and then you start to see white flight.
But I mean, what you're saying is when you say they decided, who was the they?
Oh,
I mean,
the neighborhood improvement associations.
Okay.
So basically, homeowners in a neighborhood, in an effort to protect, racial purity or property values or whatever the kind of stereotype was that they were trying to maintain, would get together and make decisions about what was going to happen in the neighborhood. And so you got either through just general consensus or even through some families in the neighborhood putting pressure on other families in the neighborhood. They had neighborhood improvement associations that would make sure that these things happened. So it didn't necessarily have to be that every family in the neighborhood thought that this was a good and fair and right thing to do, but they could be pressured by other people in the neighborhood in an effort to maintain property values.
Okay, but these organizations had no real legal standing, did they?
No, but the covenants
had
that
the
they put in
pressure.
the deeds did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Do you have another question?
Yeah, I just have two comments, personal experiences related to what Dr. Kale said, and also what you just said, Dr. Charles. So I work in Child Protective Services, and I take phone calls related to child abuse and neglect. And about 3 weeks ago, I got a phone call from a Hispanic woman who had a real strong Puerto Rican accent. And the program that we have to collect information about the families who call specifies whether we have to designate whether the family is Hispanic, and in the racial categories, which are really strict, black, white, I think Asian, Pacific Islander. So she's telling me about this family, and I'm gonna change the names. Her name was Santiago, and she's telling me about this family, the let's say Cruz family. How do you spell Cruz? C-R-U-Z, okay. So then I said, okay, so the family you're talking about, are they white Hispanic or black Hispanic? She said, what? I said, are they black Hispanic or white Hispanic? She said, what? I don't understand what you're talking about. And I was like, oh my God, a woman who doesn't pay attention to skin color. So I said, are they light-skinned or dark-skinned? She said, oh, they're white Hispanic and so am I. And I thought that was so cool that, she didn't understand what I was saying in terms of the race of Hispanics, or at least she didn't consciously understand what was going on. And I just thought that was really cool, given the way that, we feel about skin color and race and all that. So that was just a personal experience that I had that I wanted to bring up from what you were saying, Dr. Kale, about Hispanics. And then I have another coworker who is black Hispanic. He's from Puerto Rico. He moved to New York, and then he came to Philadelphia, I think he said, when he was 7. And he said, yeah, he was talking about when he moved. He said, yeah, when I was in New York, they thought I was Cuban. And then he said, and then he addressed the segregation here in Philadelphia. He said, I never seen, Philadelphia is such a segregated city. We don't know about that in New York. But when I got here and I saw the different neighborhoods, I was like, what the? So he kind of related what you were saying about Philly being very segregated. I think to some extent we self-segregate, but he just thought that that was really weird to him. So that was just two experiences that kind of relates to what you guys were talking about. So.
Thank you. May I respond to your first example? So I think that's so interesting because what I didn't get to say, I was trying to rush through, I had so many things I wanted to say, was that the Census Bureau is considering putting Hispanic back as a racial category in the next, so there is discussion about that now. So right now it's a separate category, right? That's why you have white, black, or other. And we have to realize that these are things that social scientists and policymakers, they come up with these categories for measurement purposes, but real people, I mean, that's just not how we think of ourselves, right? So there is some argument about that, whether it makes sense to think about Hispanic as a pan group, right? Whether, I think for social scientists, they're thinking about these color categories, maybe not just in terms of skin color, but in terms of ancestry and, you know, being European and maybe having different kinds of experiences. But we know that families are all mixed in lots of different ways. If you have a multiracial family, you could have, you know, dad might look one way, mom looks another way, you have 3 or 4 kids, they could all look very different. Are they all different races? Right? Not by the way we classify, no, but maybe in everyday life. I had a student whose father was black, mother was white. She was light-skinned, you know, light brown hair, but she had a sister who was blonde hair, you know, blue eyes, and just was white, and no one thought of her as multiracial. And then she had another sister who was much darker, and no one would question her as being not black. So, but they're all the same race if we use it as ancestry, but not in terms of, maybe not in terms of outside experiences, right? So these things are complicated, but thank you.
Yeah, and the other thing that's helpful about that, though, in understanding racial stratification in the US is that when we can distinguish Latinos who are black, Latinos who are white, Latinos who are mixed, what you see is that in terms of residential segregation, black Latinos who are black have an experience of segregation that is comparable to the experience of blacks.
And same with our kids, the friendship stuff.
Right.
Correct.
So, and that those who are white are the ones who are able to integrate into predominantly white neighborhoods, largely based on length of time in the US if they're immigrants, and their social class characteristics, which is a traditional American stratification story, and that those who are mixed are usually in between. So that there's actually a sort of second way to check the effect of skin color stratification or racial stratification by being able to distinguish Latinos by not just that national origin, but also their racial classification.
Before I sit down, let me just say that there are parts of Philadelphia where there are the Hispanic people up and down 5th Street, for example, where, you know, as a child protective services worker, I go out into neighborhoods, and there are neighborhoods where black Hispanics and white Hispanics mix. They, you know, they do live in the same area, and I guess that could partially be poverty and income.
Yeah.
So there are parts of North Philadelphia
But
where
it's also probably national origin. They're all Puerto Rican, or they're all Dominican, right? And again, in Puerto Rico and in the Dominican Republic, that national origin has a level of importance that is often difficult for Americans to understand because we don't rally around that in the same way. So race doesn't have the same salience necessarily, particularly I think as immigrant groups leave and come to a new country where they share language and they share other cultural aspects to their national origin. So the segregation I was talking about for Philadelphia was truly black/African Americans, non-Hispanic blacks, and whites. But Latinos here, you know, they're just a much smaller proportion of the population. But the ones who are darker, the ones who are poorer, the ones who are more recent immigrants actually here and across the country tend to live in segregated black communities because that's where the cheapest housing is.
And there's a circular nature of it when returning to the Dominican Republic, for example. So having experienced that greater segregation in the U.S., like the Afro-consciousness of the Dominican returning sort of is changing Dominican culture as well, where it's sort of there are myths of racial democracy or that the national identity trumps all, but you see as people reflect on their experiences in the U.S., well, am I just Dominican or am I Afro-Dominican?
That's why we need genetics to sort it all out, right?
There was a question over here.
Yes, my question is pursuant to race. Actually, it's a question and a comment. The question is, if we have 23 pairs of human chromosomes, we all agree on that? And science to date has not found any correlation between black and white on those 23 pairs of chromosomes. So how real is race? What I'm holding in my hand is a thesis that I've been working on. It's called The Racing of America, Race, a Social Construct, and its Existential Fallacy. So I question the fact that race is real. I think it is the cognitive imprisonment of this social construct that has held the American society in color and cultural bias since the 17th century. Also, and I think race is a product of Eurocentric, aristocratic, hegemonic, systemic thought and structures between simply given to us between the 17th and 19th centuries. So my question is, how real is it? And the comment is, do you think we need to change the lexicon of American society's language? I think we're using antiquated language to define a 21st century multicultural global society. So epithets like black and white, I think they're meaningless, they're colors, and to build demographics and stratifications around a color and then submit that, and disseminate that information to the public, it's demeaning. So I think it's the lexicon that we need to change. I admire what everybody's saying on the panel, but until we look at the lexicon of the English language, because there's a theory, his name is William Ockham, about 13th century, he was a philosopher. It was called Occam's razor. And so we're always adding words to the lexicon, but how many times do we delete words from the lexicon? And I think if we start the process of deleting words from the lexicon, we can have a rational discourse on this social construct. So Occam was saying, listen, and it was primarily germane to metaphysics, but what he was saying was, if it doesn't add value, then why are we continuing to use, a parlance, if you will, or epithets, or, appellations to describe something that perhaps has no relevance? So I'd just like you to address this issue about race being real. Thank you.
Okay. That's going to have to be our last question because we're at time. If anybody wants to take it on just briefly, I don't think you're going to get argument.
No, I mean, I agree with most
I
of
think
it.
that this is partially what
Yeah.
we are here to do, is responding to present-day science, which has indeed confirmed that race is not a real biological category. However, we live with the legacy of racial thought and racial categorizations, and we also live, with the reality of racism. I think some of the reasons that we hold on to the concept of race are blackness. In my case is that I am conscious of anti-black racism. So I know that these categories have sociological meaning, even if they don't have biological meaning. But certainly language is loaded and it carries a lot of weight, and that's why it's Negro to colored to African American, Black, and trying to move away from the stigma carried with each of these words. And we can keep trying.
I mean, I think we spoke at the very beginning about how we somehow, for something to be real, we have to have a gene or something we can point to. And I think for us, it's that if man defines his situation as real, it's real in its consequences. And I could decide that I'm green or that I'm, human, but that doesn't mean that when I walk down the street, I'm not being classified in particular ways. And I think the problem is that those labels do continue to carry meaning. And it's still the language of white supremacy. So, I mean, there is value in whiteness in our society. So whether the non-whites are Black or brown or yellow or whatever, there is power, there are resources, there are all sorts of things that are wrapped up in that. And I think that's why the lexicon hasn't changed. So that, I mean, when Deb and I were kids, we couldn't have checked a mixed box, right? I mean, I remember getting in trouble for trying to check more than one box on state forms at school, where now, I actually had an existential crisis because I'm mixed, my husband's mixed, we have 2 mixed kids, and I actually filled out all of their paperwork and made them Black and thought, oh no. But the truth is, we could decide they were whatever we wanted to make them decide because it's not really real. Right? So in a biological or genetic sense, but in terms of the way that they experience the world and the way that we socialize them and the way the world sees them, we actually did maintain the set of languages and understandings that really do organize American life.
They're not relevant. I'm listening to the panel. On the Hill in particular. So I'm saying you could actually go through your whole life with an identity crisis, but you shouldn't have to. Because at the end of the day, everybody here is a Homo sapien.
Right.
And then we ought to be able to put a dot, a period, right. You follow what I'm saying?
I do.
I think we do need to always be more imaginative on what kinds of communities we can build that are not imprisoned to our past, right? I mean, we don't live outside of our histories, but there are always people who come up and imagine something different and imagine something new. And a lot of people usually think they're crazy when they're in the middle of imagining it. But it's those moments when we can actually create something different and create a different world. And I think we're all part of that project, right?
Can I say-
And that's where we want to move.
Just one thing, I'm a fan of Occam's razor, so I'm not arguing race is biologically based. I mean, no, of course
none of
not.
us is.
But
None of
you're
us
saying
is.
it's not relevant, and I guess I would argue with you about that. It's not real in the biological sense, but it's relevant. It affects every aspect of my life, whether I like it or not. So, but that's why we study it, that's all I'm saying. It's relevant, so we study it, because it's relevant. If it stops being relevant, I'm happy to move on to a different topic.
Yes, let us hope that day comes in our lifetimes. Yeah. Good, thank you, everybody, for coming and for the very provocative discussion. Thank you, panelists.